Thank you. My name's John Gregan. I'm facilitator for this third session. Look, it was a great start to see all these guys up in their green shirts. I'm sure Niall and Roshean might have something to do with that lovely green Irish colour. But Flynn, you're a very impressive young speaker, a young man, and having heard you speak, I can understand why. But well done. Keep that up. You'll do really well. Okay, a big thank you to MPI for becoming a gold sponsor for this event. And now Caroline Ames is the On-Farm Support Regional Manager for Canterbury, which means she helps farmers convert science into practice or practical ways to become, to make it work in their own businesses. But the other thing about Caroline is she's got a farming background too, so she understands about dairy farming. She's been involved in dairy farming for many years. So with that corporate knowledge comes some practical red-back government knowledge as well. So thanks, Caroline.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm Caroline from the On-Farm Support Team. So our aim is to support farmers and growers to continue to be successful in a changing world. So that means we can come and sit down with you, help understand where you are within your business and help you get to where you want to go by tapping into the right expertise and knowledge that you need. At MPI we have 4 goals at the moment that we're working towards. One of those is to double export values by 2034, deliver solutions for New Zealand farmers to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, protect New Zealand from harmful pests and diseases, and back the primary sector to win. So I thought it was fitting that we would introduce this next session because it's really touching on some of those points. And so I think it aligns really nicely with that what lies ahead in North GHG and profit. And I encourage you to think about those things that are going to be good for your bottom line as well. Being green doesn't have to cost you, it can actually have a real benefit to financials for your business as well. And you can see that there's a few of those things up there which I'm sure we'll go into. So thank you very much, enjoy the session. Always love this event because it's nice and practical and it's something you can take home and think about in your own business.
Thanks, Caroline. If you were in the US today and you went to a social gathering, a general rule of thumb is don't talk politics or religion. In Canterbury, if you're mixing with your urban neighbours, nitrates and greenhouse gases are probably a couple of things you don't really want to talk about at the family barbecue. But our next 2 presenters are scientists in these very fields. But unlike many of us, they actually know what they're talking about. Dr. Roshean is not only a senior scientist at DairyNZ, but she was a national finalist in the SMG Young Farmer of the Year in 2021. So she doesn't only talk the talk, she walks the walk. She knows what farmers are doing and what works on farm, and she was also an environment consultant for many years. So Roshean will be speaking firstly, but also with her is Tait. He's our co-presenter. He also works for DairyNZ as a senior partnership lead. But again, someone who keeps farming hands-on, having been brought up on a farm and eventually returning to the family farm where he was share milking. Now, earlier we had a question over there, or a query from a very knowledgeable young man who talked about the extra 40 kilograms of nitrogen that was being put on this farm that we weren't probably aware of. Well, that man is Burbery, and he's a DairyNZ water quality scientist. So he knows what he's talking about, and he's in the crowd, and he can answer any other nubbly questions that might come along. But if I could call Roshean to come up and start us off today, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Alright, thank you very much, John, for the warm welcome, and it's awesome to be with you all here today. I see the rain has stopped just for us to come inside, so that's great. So today we're talking about some of the environmental risks and opportunities, and we know in particular water quality it's really important locally, both for our farmers but also for the communities that we live in. So today I'm just going to take you through some of the principles and some of the drivers behind nitrogen leaching losses, and then Nick's going to take us through some stuff relating to greenhouse gas emissions. So if you're following along in your handouts, we're talking from page 35 onwards. I've popped in your handouts there a simplified version of the nitrogen cycle for our dairy farms. And so we know for our dairy farms we've got lots of inputs of nitrogen coming into our system, so in the form of fertiliser, imported feed, and even through things like fixation from clovers that you might have in your pastures, and outputs from the farm system, any feed we export, and for our dairy farms, obviously a lot of nitrogen going out in our products such as meat and milk. The nitrogen cycle, so following along on this board here, we know for our internationally competitive pasture-based systems, it's really the dairy cow urine patch which is a hotspot for our nitrogen leaching on our farms. And there are some other sources of nitrogen leaching, but a lot of those we can manage through really good farming practices. So I'm going to focus a lot today on drivers of nitrogen loss, and I'm also going to highlight some of the really great practices that the farm are doing here to help manage their nitrogen loss risk. Importantly though, we know that the urine patch is a hotspot for nitrogen leaching, but the amount of nitrogen which actually gets leached is really dependent on things like soil type, climate or weather conditions, and also things like irrigation management. Some of those other things which could be sources of nitrogen leaching are things like nitrogen fertiliser or effluent, but through really good management, careful placement of these in terms of timing and amounts, avoiding any applications into critical source areas, that's CSA on your handout, which are low-lying areas or waterways, are really great practices, avoiding any nutrients getting into them to help reduce that. So in terms of things we can do when it comes to the cow urine patch, anything that encourages plant uptake of nitrogen, reduces the number of urine patches or the density of urine patches that get distributed. And what's really important is we know autumn is a particularly risky period, so any urine deposited on farms in autumn is at high risk of being lost, because we know around here as well we get a lot of our rainfall through that winter period and pastures aren't growing quite so well. So some of the really great practices that Mick and Kirsten are doing, we've heard about them already today. Mick sends a lot of his culls off farm quite early, so he's reducing the amount of urine patches which are distributed onto the paddocks at that during autumn there through that management. And he's also using different amounts of nitrogen fertiliser for his non-effluent and his effluent area. So he's accounting for that nitrogen being applied as effluent, and he's thinking carefully about timing of the fertiliser based on pasture growth. He's also managing his irrigation. We haven't heard a lot about that today. There's some soil moisture probes on the farm here, so carefully managing that irrigation to ensure we're not getting excessive amounts of drainage. So in terms of nitrogen leaching, it's the nitrogen loading that we apply on the soils in terms of the urine patches, but it's also the amount of drainage that occurs that will determine how much gets leached. So using those moisture probes, we're minimising any risk of leaching during our growing season, which is really great. Mick mentioned using direct drilling for establishing new pastures. That's another great practice. So we're releasing less nitrogen by establishing pastures that way, and not turning over the soil and releasing a whole lot of mineral nitrogen. So it's another awesome practice to see, and Mick's currently not cropping on the farm as well, which sometimes can be a bit of a risk as well. So some great practices that Mick's doing. Later on in our session we're going to talk through some scenarios that we've run for some potential opportunities to just see what impacts might be in terms of environment and profitability. Another thing I wanted to highlight here on your handout is we've summarised the purchase nitrogen surplus for the farm. You'll see Mick's purchase nitrogen surplus. So purchase nitrogen surplus is the nitrogen which is purchased or brought into the farm, so fertiliser and feed, minus the nitrogen which leaves the farm as product. So I've put the equation up at the very top there for you. But so Mick's got about 156 kilos of nitrogen fertiliser coming onto the farm, and we know already he's a pretty low user of imported feed, so only a little bit of nitrogen being imported onto the farm in terms of supplements, and about 110 kilos going out the gate in milk, leaving him with a purchase nitrogen surplus of 51. And if we look at the bottom part here, this is showing where Mick is in relation to other farms in the area. So the shaded zone is 50% of the farms in the Canterbury region, and mix sitting quite below this, and that's due to lower inputs, lower imported feed, and also the relatively lower nitrogen fertiliser use. On one of the pages there we've got a graph showing where he sits relative to others in terms of total nitrogen fertiliser. When we plotted this on a similar graph you've seen earlier, you've got operating profit versus purchase nitrogen surplus. So Mick and Kirsten's farm are sitting pretty nicely here in this highly profitable and lower purchase nitrogen surplus. Why do we look at purchase nitrogen surplus? It's just another metric or indicator which can tell us a little bit about something, a little bit about nitrogen use on farm, and some of our studies show that it does have some relation with nitrogen leaching risk. So it's all about how efficiently are we managing those nutrients through the system. I think that's almost all I had to cover off. Let's just check.
If anyone wants any clarification or questions, just please ask, Roshean, as you're speaking.
Okay, there's one more thing I wanted to talk to you about. So as part of our DairyNZ research program, we're currently looking into the use of bulk milk urea as a potential another piece of information or indicator for dietary nitrogen surplus. So we know in our New Zealand dairy systems, often cows are eating diets which have more nitrogen in them than what they require for production. And as part of our low-end systems project, we're trying to provide a bit more context around bulk milk urea numbers. So that's just urea in your bulk milk. You'll have it on your milk dockets already, and see how we can use that as a bit of an indicator of surplus nitrogen in the diet. And we know if there's surplus nitrogen in the diet, the cow's excreting a lot of that out the back end. So our urine patches have more nitrogen in them, which increases our risk of nitrogen leaching. And so in our project, we're aiming to provide more context around the tool and using bulk milk urea as in this way, and hoping that will help identify perhaps some opportunities to optimise how we use nitrogen in the system, and perhaps ask me some questions a bit about that. So this is just a bit of a work in progress and something that we're in development at the moment, designed to be a sort of starting point to seek further information. So we're not suggesting using milk urea as a sole metric, but more as a conversation starter, see if there's any opportunities to optimise your system, or optimise nitrogen use in your system. And important to use alongside other information and other tools that you're already doing. So I think I'll leave it there, John.
Thanks, Roshean. Do we have any questions? Yes.
What is good going to look like, depending on the results that you're seeing so far, in terms of fertiliser N?
In relation to milk urea or just fertiliser N use? So one thing that we're seeing, we've been tracking some real farms who have been keeping an eye on milk urea, and sometimes it tells us a little bit about whether you get your timing of nitrogen fertiliser optimised for when the cows graze the pastures. So we know when we put fertiliser on to pastures, the pastures will increase in protein and nitrogen content initially, and then you get a dry matter burst. If you're grazing the pastures too soon after the nitrogen fertiliser goes on, it's really highly concentrated in terms of nitrogen, but you're not getting the best growth out of it, and that means the cows are eating this surplus nitrogen, and a lot of it's going to be peed out the back end and not turned into milk. So sometimes you could use it as a tool to see in terms of optimising your nitrogen fertiliser management in terms of timing, or perhaps using it strategically, seeing what times of the year you're actually needing extra nitrogen. So using it alongside other information. Obviously Mick's talked a lot about how he's managing his pastures, not taking away from any of that, just as this is another piece of information that may help you, tell you a bit about what's going on in terms of surplus nitrogen in the diet.
Actually, I've got a question for you. I was listening to Jamie Mackay, which I'm sure many of us do, on the Country Show, and Nicola Willis was in a paddock somewhere, and she indicated that they were using some sort of fan to spread the urea or the urine from the cow, so it wouldn't land in patches. Can you tell us anything about that, or is that top secret?
I don't have any knowledge of, sorry, I have heard about that, but I'm not in the know about that. Sorry, I can't answer that one, John.
Okay, thank you. Well, Roshean, you'll stay here. Well, I've got another question over here.
Question on Victoria. There's another paper of obviously no Victoria that there's an opportunity for nutritionists to get in that add protein.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, the
Roshean?
question was, is there not a risk that if we see really low milk urea, it might be an opportunity for nutritionists to sell us a whole lot of products? Absolutely, that's a risk that we're managing with this tool. So our messaging is focus on trends in milk urea, focus on extremes, use it as a conversation starter or a prompt to seek further information. So have a look at what the cows are actually eating, do your due diligence and actually determine is there a need for something like that. You might have a look at your feeds and look at your milk production and the cows are actually doing fine. So we certainly want farmers to be really factoring in what's the cost and what's the benefit you might see when you're looking at making decisions based on something like that. So ensuring that it's a profitable decision that you're making is our sort of main message there. So it's just another piece of information to go alongside everything else that you factor into your decision making.
That's the problem though. It's not profit or complaint related, it's showing whether complicated metric having competition.
So at the moment, we're not seeing this as being something that actually we're being as strong as saying we don't see this milk urea as appropriate for anything like a compliance tool, and it also doesn't tell you anything about farm profitability. So it's just another piece of information to look at. It may help you, if you can use it in a way that it helps you optimise how you're using nitrogen and nutrients in your system, that could actually benefit you in terms of some cost savings, depending on how you use it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, if we have no more questions, we'll get Nick up and he'll talk to us about greenhouse gases. Cheers, Nick.
Thank you, John. So we've talked about nitrogen, and now we're going to change tack a wee bit and talk about greenhouse gases. Obviously, it's, as Caroline said, there's a whole focus on this from the government, but there's also a whole research part around this as well, around investing in technologies that may help break the link that is dry matter intake to methane. And that's one of the real big challenges. And it's some of the research we're doing here at DairyNZ. So I just want to talk a wee bit about sources of emissions, particularly for dairy farms. I'll talk a wee bit about why this is a real focus for a number of different organisations, including DairyNZ. And then I want to dive a bit into what's happening here on farm with Mick and Kirsten and try to debunk some of these numbers for you to help you understand what you're seeing. And obviously, now that we're getting incentives on the tables around reducing greenhouse gases, what that might mean for you and your dairy farm, particularly in pasture-based systems. So in terms of the sources of emissions, and this carries on in the booklet for you, there's two big biological sources of emissions for dairy farms. And you've heard of these, obviously over the last few years there's been quite a focus on this, and it is around methane and nitrous oxide. So methane is the largest gas that is produced by cows, and how she produces that is really around burping or erupting out of her rumen. As she eats and masticates her food, it's then broken down into volatile fatty acids, which she uses for energy. The byproduct of that is carbon dioxide and hydrogen. The issue with that is if there's too much hydrogen within the rumen, she starts to get into the situation where the pH is in imbalance, and she can lead to acidosis. So through evolution, she's developed a subset of microbes within that rumen that take that CO2 and hydrogen and combine it together and produce methane, CH4. There's no use for her to use that in any way within the rumen, so she belches it out. It's pretty static what we see from dry matter intake to methane production at about 21.6 grams of methane for every kilogram of dry matter intake. So that's the thing that we're trying to look at in terms of research and in terms of new technologies through AgriZero and things like that to try and break that kind of link. The other major greenhouse gas is nitrous oxide, and that, similar to what Roshean was talking about in terms of the nitrogen cycle, what happens is when you have an excess, nitrogen in excess in the soil pool, or in nitrate form within that soil, it can either be lost to groundwater, which is nitrogen loss, or it can denitrify to nitrous oxide, so NO3- to N2O. And that's released out of the soil, somewhere between 10 and 20% of biological emissions. So the key thing to think about here is anything you do to reduce that nitrogen surplus that Roshean talked about will have benefits of reducing nitrous oxide. Both quite different greenhouse gases as well, if you think about it. Methane's very short-lived, but quite an impact in terms of warming impact. Nitrous oxide's a bit longer-lived, a bit less of an impact as well. So those are the two kind of major gases that we have to think about in a dairy farm system. Shifting on to kind of the why are we focusing on this, obviously there's a number of different levers and reasons why. If you'd asked me a couple of years ago, there would have been quite a different reason than there is now. But what we're seeing is some really key drivers coming out of our customers, particularly our buyers of milk internationally. The big companies like Danone, Mars and Nestle are setting targets in their supply chain, which then obviously as we supply them comes back to us. These are some pretty hefty targets by 2030, but the good news is as a sector and as a producer of dairy products, we're already very efficient. So we are at the front in terms of the desirability of our milk that we produce, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about how we could get better as well. Because resting and not doing anything, as other countries might use technology that might not be available to us in our pasture-based systems, then we could lose that competitive advantage. We did a bit of work with Fonterra earlier this year looking at what are those farm system levers that drive both profitability and reduce emissions intensity. So we combined our dairy-based kind of dairy-based platform alongside the physical results from Fonterra, and there were kind of three things that came out of that. The first was focus on homegrown feed. The more homegrown feed you obviously grow, it's a big driver of profit, as we've seen from Nick and Kirsten, but it also reduces emissions intensity. The second one is around supplement use, and if you are using supplements, what is the embedded emissions that come from that? Obviously, PKE or soybean meal has large footprints associated with it. So if you are using supplements, those that were generally had lower footprints but higher profitability, we're focusing more on some of those lower embedded emission sources of supplementary feed. And the last one was really around nitrogen. So once again, those that had low nitrogen surplus often were higher in profitability, but also had a low emissions intensity. So those are some of the kind of drivers that we see within a dairy farm system and those sources of emissions. I'll just talk a wee bit on future technologies, and I won't talk too much. How are we for time, John?
Yeah, no, we're pretty good, Nick, but you are between now and lunch.
Yeah, I know. So obviously you will have heard of different mechanisms and things that are going on through AgriZero in terms of inhibitors and vaccines and things like that. These are all future technologies. Some have shown some promise, some have shown some results internationally. What we do at DairyNZ is try to test some of that and the validity of them in a pasture-based system, because obviously in a TMR system that you might find overseas where you can control the diet, it's easier to put these additives or inhibitors into the system. But here we get maybe a chance twice a day if you're in that sort of system, but around pasture-based systems it's really not that much. So the likes of Arabidopsis, the seaweed, overseas that's shown Arabidopsis. I'll get it right one day. That's shown promising results overseas, around 17% reduction in methane for every kilogram of dry matter, or when it's fed as part of the total mixed ration diet. We haven't seen those replications here in New Zealand, though we're seeing more like a bit lower, but the issue is around concentration of the active ingredient within that seaweed. Similarly, around, you will have heard of Bovia, which is DSM's 3-NOP, which inhibits the methanogen activity within the rumen. Feedlot trials have shown 30 to 40% reduction in methane. Here in New Zealand, it's more like 5%. So, and noting that this is not available for use in New Zealand yet as well. So we're not seeing those sort of technologies come to market and be effective in New Zealand systems just yet. There are also CRB and LIC are looking at low methane bulls, obviously looking at, there's some proof of concept around genetic divergence around bulls that have low methane output, and now they're testing them in kind of field trials as well. For us at DairyNZ, we've been focusing quite heavily on feed and what goes into animals and what that shows in terms of methane production. We have done some early life intervention before, and that trial's wrapped up, but now we're really looking at a bit of work with Chuggas and Ireland around different seasonality of pasture, different regions of pasture, different immediate pasture, and what does that look like in terms of output. And what we can say is the early results show that it is quite a significant amount of difference in terms of what is produced per kilogram of dry matter intake. So the number has always been 21.6 grams. From our early research, it's looking more like somewhere around 17 to 18 grams of methane per kilogram of dry matter intake. So there are some promising results just looking at our unique pasture in New Zealand. I'll just wrap up and talk a wee bit about Mick and Kirsten's farm and what we see, because obviously some of these numbers have changed over time and they are quite confusing. So in the handout you'll see there's the farm insight support from Fonterra this year, looking at the amount of emissions from the farm. So you'll see that between 2023 and 2024 it drops to this year. Obviously went down from 741 to 698 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram per tonne of fat and protein corrected milk. And I'll get to that because that sounds really confusing, and it is in a way. The reason for that is just the jump in production that Mick and Kirsten had and the team had at the farm. So that extra production, when you're looking at intensity, obviously it's divided over the amount of product produced. So when we look through that table, biological methane's around 495 kilograms of methane per hectare. Nitrous oxide is 9 kilograms per hectare. When you convert that to CO2 equivalents, there's an emissions factor that you must apply. That's around 28 for methane and 298 for nitrous oxide. So that comes out at around 15 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per hectare. When you times that by 265 hectares, it's about 3.8 million kilograms of CO2 equivalents. So it's a fair whack, but you have to look at that all in perspective of what is actually produced. So that's your total greenhouse gases. So then when you divide it by the production, 426,000 kilograms of milk solids, it comes out at somewhere around 9.1, 9.2 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of milk solids. That's the number that you would have received in the last few years through Farm Insights Report. But what they've done this year is change it to looking at fat and protein corrected milk. So for those of you who have seen that, fat and protein corrected milk is a way to compare internationally different milk for volume and fat and protein content, obviously. There's a long drawn out equation that needs to be applied to that, and you base it on the unique milk, fat and protein that's produced on the farm. But there is a simple formula. If you just divide it by 13, it generally comes out with about the same number. So that number is, in this year's Farm Insights Report, is 698 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per tonne of fat and protein corrected milk. Why is that important? You will have heard and you will all know that there's customer incentives on the table from Fonterra this year. Other companies are looking at those incentives as well. The magical number is around under 710 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per tonne of fat and protein corrected milk. Puts you in the bracket for that customer incentive, so somewhere between 10 and 25 cents. So obviously Mick and Kirsten will be, and the team will be part of that. Where exactly it's going to land, nobody knows just yet, but obviously through their contracts with Nestle, that incentive is there for farmers to try and drive towards a lower emissions intensity footprint. That is about me. Questions, John?
Yeah, look, we've got a wee bit of time now, so if anyone's got any questions for Roshean or Nick, now's a great time to ask them. I know at Christmas time I've got a couple of very left-leaning sisters who question me about my dairy practices. So there's a great chance to get it from the horse's mouth and actually have some facts from them next time you meet those people around your Christmas table. No, we're quite happy with the nitrogen emergency that's been called in Canterbury at the moment. What's your comments on that? Roshean? Okay. I know Lee's here. Lee doesn't want to comment on that. I know it's a bit of a hot button topic. Should we leave that? Okay. Well, thanks very much, Lee.
We got one more section.
One more section to go. Okay, sorry.
So, sitting down doing this bit of a presentation, we sat down with Mick and Kirsten and said, so what does future scenarios look like for you? And then what is the impact on, obviously, nitrogen loss, purchase nitrogen surplus, total emissions, emissions intensity and profit. And we did some behind the scenes modelling. Obviously, trying to quantify this is hard because the quantum of changes in terms of pasture production and also in terms of also profit and the reduction in greenhouse gases on nitrogen is very hard to quantify. We're not talking about massive numbers here, we're talking about indications of trends and direction. So do you want to start going through, Roshean, and we can talk through, and this might spark some questions.
So first of all we wanted to see where the farm is at right now, so we did to get an estimation of our nitrogen leaching loss. So this is in your handouts on page 41, I believe. We determined estimate for the nitrogen leaching loss for this farm is about 38, and then the rest of the inputs are from Mick and Kirsten's insights reports. The first scenario we wanted to look at was changes to the nitrogen fertiliser strategy and autumn management. So last year Mick actually did keep the cows on farm, the cull cows on farm a little bit longer than he normally would, and so we were able to model compared to the previous season what that strategy of culling cows by 20th of March would look like, combining it with using a bit more nitrogen fertiliser in spring and less fertiliser in autumn. And so in terms of nitrogen leaching losses, having less nitrogen fertiliser applied in autumn and also having less stock grazing in autumn reduces our nitrogen leaching loss. We're just showing direction of travel in this table rather than the exact numbers. In terms of purchase nitrogen surplus, it's possibly likely to stay similar if the total amounts of nitrogen in fertiliser and feed imported stay the same and production stays the same. But it may reduce if we're able to get more production perhaps, or if maybe less imported feed is needed because we might be harvesting a bit more in spring if we've got more growth through the year. So then Nick will take us through greenhouse gases.
Yeah, so the questions that we had were really around pasture production changes from this, but also changes in nitrogen loss. So if there's a change in obviously nitrogen loss, that soil, that purchase nitrogen surplus is going to maybe reduce. That'll have an impact on kind of nitrous oxide, so total emissions we will probably see, but that depends on pasture production changes as well. Similarly, we would, if the production stayed the same, milk production that is, but we saw a drop in nitrous oxide emissions, then you're probably going to see a slight reduction in emissions intensity. In terms of profit, it really does depend on the end response and that pasture production. But we know from research that increasing any amount of pasture production or homegrown feed generally does lift profit. So it wasn't massive quantums of change, but there was some little levels of change there.
Another scenario we looked at was what happens if we increase individual paddock performance. And Mick said earlier there's quite a range in individual paddock performance from that sort of 14, 15 tonne right up to 18, 19 tonnes. So having a look at what impacts this might have in terms of nitrogen leaching loss. So we might get better nitrogen use efficiency of fertiliser that we apply, or pastures taking up more of that nitrogen. But depending on what we do with that extra feed, if it means we've got more animals grazing that and harvesting that, that might increase the number of year-round patches we have. So there's some trade-offs there. So we've not likely to see a lot of change there. Similar with the purchase nitrogen surplus. So over to you, Nick.
Yeah, and so if we're lifting some of those poor performing paddocks up to some of the norms, you're going to see a total pasture production increase. Obviously, if you're going to harvest that, and we talked about this before, around having a few more cows or what that looks like to fill gaps, maybe max silage, that increased, obviously, production is going to lead to increased methane, so obviously your probably total greenhouse gas is going to go up. However, depending on what you see in terms of production response from that, you might hold intensity or production per kilogram about the same, or potentially, depending on the response, see a slight reduction in that. But we wouldn't see that change too much, depending on what the milk production response from that pasture lift would be. But we do know that from our research, and it's been proven through many different trials, that for every extra tonne of homegrown feed or pasture production on farm, equates to about 428 kilograms of extra profit per hectare. So we would likely see a profit lift from that, and that's pretty logical. If you lift some of those lower performing paddocks up and turn that into milk, then you're going to see a profit lift as well.
So the third scenario was introducing some plantain into the pasture storage. We know that there's not a lot of, hasn't got plantain in the pastures at the moment. Through our DairyNZ research, we've shown at the farm scale that having plantain in pastures does reduce our nitrogen leaching. And that's through mechanisms like through diluting the urine patch nitrogen concentration. So we're expecting to see, we would see a reduction in nitrogen leaching loss risk with some plantain in the mix, but wouldn't see any differences in terms of purchase nitrogen surplus if the nitrogen fertiliser and supplement inputs stay the same, and research has sort of shown to expect similar milk production with plantain in the mix as you would without it.
And so for total greenhouse gases, you're probably going to see that reduction in nitrous oxide as plantain takes up that soil pooled nitrogen. And there is some ongoing research around the impact on methane from plantain as well, but we would likely see a reduction in total greenhouse gas emissions. And then obviously, depending on milk production from that slight reduction, we put this down as a negative for profit because we debated the impacts of establishing and maintaining plantain within the pasture sward, and that comes at a cost that you might not see any lift in production from.
Yeah, so some of our team members have done some economic modelling around use of plantain. So in catchments where nitrogen is really limiting and a huge challenge, plantain still comes out as one of the most cost-effective mitigation options in terms of dollars per kilogram of nitrogen leaching reduced. So obviously we've just factored in some extra costs for the plantain seed and maintaining it in pastures. So it does come at a cost. Fourth scenario, we know that obviously there's some infrastructure on the farm here, and just wanting to highlight, I guess, that autumn period, which is a high risk period for leaching. If the feed pig was to be used for 2 to 3 hours a day through that autumn period, removing cows from pastures for periods does reduce the amount of urine patches deposited on farm at risk of leaching, so we would expect to see a reduction in leaching loss from that. In terms of purchase nitrogen surplus, this wouldn't change unless we would import more feed to do that. So we've run a couple of scenarios here, one with no extra imported feed and one with quite a bit more imported feed, so it sort of depends.
You're likely to see a decrease in total emissions because of that nitrous oxide reduction from that autumn period, which is riskier. And you might see a change around intensity, but that depends on that change in supplements used. If you stay the same, probably not. If you increase, then you might do, but that depends on milk production response from that extra feed as well. But then, and so that leads to the kind of profit, which is it depends, and it depends on that feed utilisation or changes in supplementary feed. There's a cost that comes associated with that. So are you seeing a change in profitability? And what we've seen from its figures today already is pretty profitable based on pasture-based system anyway.
Finally, we know Mick's working towards increasing his fertility in his herd, and with a goal in the future to reduce his replacement rate from around that 25% to sort of 15 to 18% replacements. In terms of nitrogen leaching loss, there'll be a few less young stock on farm, so likely to see a reduction in nitrogen leaching with less animals on farm, but it again depends on what you do with that extra feed. If you're getting a few more cows in to eat that, maybe it'll be similar or a little bit more. Again, no change to purchase nitrogen surplus.
And so for total emissions, if there is obviously less young stock on farm or less replacements coming through, you're probably going to see a slight change in terms of total dry matter eaten, but that depends on what you do with the actual dry matter grown on farm anyway. So it depends kind of, but we might see some slight reductions. And then similarly for intensity as well. What you would see is an increase, obviously, a slight increase in profit because those young stock you don't have to look after and obviously bring through the herd, but then through to the herd, but then will that change your culling strategy as well? So it is all very depends, and the quantums are not a huge shift. It is just thinking about how does this impact my system and how does it impact both nitrogen and greenhouse gases when we're looking at changes.
You know, it's great. You've explained good science and down to a way farmers can certainly relate to it and see how it affects their business. So, have we got any questions out there? No. Well, you've obviously done a very good job of explaining greenhouse gases. So, thank you very much for that.